Fictional and Doctrinal. All throughout mankind's history, there have been fictional doctrines in the world. Myths even gave rise to religion. Even in modern Christianity, there are fictional doctrines, which are believed without question by the masses of those who think they are being taught the truth. This has caused division in the body of Christ. It has caused confusion, and will inevitably cause some to fall and worship the Antichrist in ignorance when he arrives, not knowing what they're doing, because they're unfamiliar with our Father's Word. For this particular message, this is just going to be a discussion. I'm not really going to go into any biblical scripture here. I really probably should have labeled this science fiction and doctrine, because that's what I'm going to talk about. This is a revamp of a lecture that I did years ago, which I have never posted. And I never posted it for a number of reasons. One being the subject matter it covers, a lot of people are familiar with and love. And of course, I don't want to turn any tender ears away from the truth by speaking bad about someone's favorite shows or whatever. But in this particular message, I'm going to talk about things which most have never even noticed nor perceived. Focus more on what I would call modern day fiction, which is on every TV station, whether it's local or some of the big stations. It's even on the big screen, movie screens as well. We now have shows on television such as Lucifer, a new show, and another new show called Legion. You know, isn't that odd that these shows would be out in this particular time, in this generation of the fig tree? But they're on television, and people seem to be enamored with the idea of watching them. And I don't personally get anything out of watching a movie about Lucifer. That is to say, TV's version of what they think Lucifer is, say Satan. But since television came around, there have been shows which stir the imagination. Even like some of the great books in literature, they stir the imagination with moving stories. Books once were the cornerstone of literature, whereas now it's TV and the internet. But there are people who still read. And in these shows or movies, we are given role models, lovable characters to look up to, which are seen as heroes. The writers of these shows and producers are taking us on journeys, usually weekly, seasonal, which we ourselves can never really hope to live out. But they also use their brand of logic and outlook of the world to push certain messages in these shows. Often messages which are anti-Christian, secular, or New Age, or even satanic in some cases. Science fiction is one of the most powerful outlets for this kind of messaging because it attracts the young. It attracts children. It attracts the impressionable. In these shows, the secular or humanist point of view, or even the diverse points of view which encompass homosexuality, lesbianism, or bisexuality, and even now, in the modern time, transgenderism, have become hot-button topics, whereas once on television you wouldn't have seen these things even discussed. Now, these shows have been around for a while, some of them. Others have had long-running spin-offs and series, movies, like. But when these shows all began, these things would not have been talked about. It wasn't until the 70s that these things began creeping into television, and as time has progressed through the 80s and 90s and now into the 21st century, we see these things prevalent in everything. The shows that take us on these journeys, the shows that are full of adventure and drama. The writers of these shows openly make statements against God or Christianity and act as though mankind's wisdom, that is to say fleshly wisdom, and science hold all the answers to every question that can be asked. And they cannot. They portray their messages as being the most sensible conclusions, and any view which differs from their fleshly so-called sensible view is seen and portrayed as radical or closed-minded or ignorant. And again, it doesn't matter if the shows are dramas or comedies or action-packed or movies or whatever, the messages are always the same. They're pushing them. They're pushing these messages as hard as they can go. They're ramming them down your throat. Now, if you get a Christian show doing the same thing, people will say, well, they're trying to ram Christianity down your throat. But it seems to be okay to ram secularism, humanism, and homosexuality, bisexuality, transgenderism down your throat, even in the media. So there is a double standard there. The message being in these shows is that these shows' views, in other words, their stands on these issues, are the moral high ground and the most logical answers. When they are openly biased, deceitful, and even self-righteous at times. The trouble is that everyone gets caught up in these shows, in the action of them, in the storylines, and the characters, the lovable, wonderful, heroic characters, and they never even perceive the messages which are being planted in their minds. Some do perceive it, very few. If you think these shows are completely harmless, then all you need to do is take a quick look back at history, and it will show you they is not as harmless as they appear. One good example was a radio show, which before television, people would gather around their radios and listen to radio shows, much like people sit around and watch television shows today. But in the year of 1938, on the date of October 30th, Orson Welles did a live radio broadcast of a show called The War of the Worlds, which is an interesting story. However, some of the listeners actually believed the events were real, and that the Earth was under attack from aliens from Mars. Some had tuned in late, others had not heard the disclaimer when the show came on or began, and people panicked. Some very nearly committed suicide, others went out and gathered up mobs, shot up water towers, thinking that these water towers were metal Martian machines walking around on the Earth set to devour the human race. And this just goes to show you the power that a suggestion can have. And that was radio. Now we've got visual too. And it's put out there at 60 hertz a second, which a lot of people agree that 60 hertz a second is kind of a flash rate as far as it's flashing so fast till you can't see the flashes. That's how we get motion in the pictures. Plus you're getting 60 frames a second or 30 frames a second or 24 frames a second, whatever. But 60 hertz seems to be a gateway into the human mind for some reason. Science fiction, like any story which enthralls an audience, is set to make us suspend our disbelief. In other words, we escape into these shows. It doesn't matter whether it's a show like Star Trek or Star Wars or movies even, or whatever. It could be a television show like Dragon Ball Z, for instance. I mean, there's a lot of darkness in Dragon Ball Z, even though, that was a show that I actually got into as an older person. And really was in disbelief at the messages in it, because they have a character named Hercule Satan. And of course, people are holding up signs in the arena that say, "We love Satan, we love Satan, we love Satan," and they're even chanting it. And of course, kids are watching this. Because Dragon Ball Z, if you're not familiar with it, is a cartoon. It's anime. As a science fiction fan, I have delved into these shows and movies since I was a kid. I too have gotten caught up in these stories and have enjoyed these shows from the time I was a child. It was not until I began to study our Father's Word and had my eyes open to the truth that I began seeing deeper messages being pumped out by these shows. Kids and young adults seem to be the most susceptible. And these messages in these shows cause youth to form opinions and ideals which are based on the shows and the lovable characters of the shows which the children and the young adults wish to emulate. Now, I've already mentioned this show once before, but one such show, one such dynasty of shows, you could say, is of course the household name that everyone knows. I speak, of course, of Star Trek. There are, of course, other shows and movies which also portray such messages, like I said, the aforementioned Star Wars, Doctor Who, Battlestar Galactica, Babylon 5, Stargate, and many others. For the most part, these shows and movies are packed with positive messages of the do the right thing attitude, the stand for good attitude, the be fair and not biased attitude. Yet many never even take note of the negative or darker messages contained within these shows or movies. They seem to gloss right over them or merely dismiss them. But what effect do they have on our psyche? Well, no one can really say. I'm not saying by watching these shows you're going to turn into a Trekkie or a Whovian or whatever, though people do a lot of cosplay. I'm merely going to point out some of the darker messages I have seen in these shows and or movies over the years, and you can decide for yourself what you think about these messages. Now, you will probably have to go and watch these shows. You may even be familiar with the shows. You will probably remember a lot of them as I speak of them. But you will have to go and watch them again now to be able to pick up on these things. Now, of course, the first science fiction and longest running show is Doctor Who, which was created in 1963. And it ran till, I think, 1989. Then there was a number of years that it did not run. 1996, they came out with a movie, and then 2005, they revamped the series, and it's still running to this very day. But Star Trek was created in the year 1964 and went through a series of, I believe, 2 pilots before it was picked up as a television series in 1966. The show ran until 1969, when it ended because of ratings, and became a cartoon in 1973 or 74. I forget what year that exactly was. And that was short-lived too. That only ran a season or so, maybe 2 seasons, but Paramount brought the original characters back in 1979 for the movie Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which now has many sequels and many spin-off shows such as Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Star Trek Enterprise, and many fan films, and also a brand new series called Star Trek Discovery. And plus, we have the modern movies that have been done by J.J. Abrams, which is a different version of Star Trek in an alternate timeline where the USS Enterprise totally looks different from the TV or the movie Enterprise. much larger, and the characters have been rewritten. I'm not a great fan of the new Star Trek movies, though they are action-packed and entertaining. I really did not like them because they strayed away from the original. But I will begin this with the original series of Star Trek. The first 3 seasons of Star Trek, the original series, Star Trek TOS as many know them, the original series, we saw values that were more in line with the time that Star Trek aired. In other words, the late 1960s. In one episode, Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and Dr. McCoy beam down to a planet which is exactly like 20th century Earth in the late 1960s. Only on this world, which was exactly like Earth, Rome had never fallen, and Rome was now in control of the world in the 20th century. Everything was the same as the 1960s on Earth. There were cars, everything was modern, only Rome still ruled the world, and there were slaves. Some of these slaves referred to themselves as sun worshippers, and all through the show we're led to believe that they are worshippers of the sun in the sky. As this particular show or episode progressed, we find out that these slaves are not in fact worshiping the sun, but are worshiping the Son of God. This revelation is given at the end of this episode by Lieutenant Uhura, who says, "They're not actually worshiping the sun. Don't you see? They're worshiping the Son of God." And Captain Kirk smiles and says, "And after all this time, the message is still spreading." And of course, this one show ends on that note, with the Enterprise moving on to its next mission, but this one show will be virtually the only time any reference is made to God or the Son of God, as to say, our Father God. And even though Christ is never mentioned by name, the Son of God is spoken in this. There are also a number of false gods which are mentioned and portrayed in this television series, such as Apollo, in the episode Who Mourns for Adonis? Or the creature, actually it's not a creature, it's a stone idol with a computer inside of it named Val or Val. Kind of a play on words for Baal worship. And a group of heathenish aliens who occupy this planet where this stone-carved god that they worship is, offer their own kind to this false god, which turns out nothing to be more than a supercomputer in the head of something that looks like a serpent or the head of a dinosaur carved into the side of a hill or mountain. Even in the original series, there is the implied view that man evolved and there was no creation. Now, as far as the original series, there are a number of things I could point to of these darker messages, but probably because this is going to be a longer talk, I'm going to jump right on ahead to the bigger points of interest. Again, I said in 1973 or 74, Star Trek TAS came out, which is the animated series. Star Trek TAS. And it had a very short run. I think there was probably 1 season of it, maybe 2, but I really tend to think it was only 1 if I remember right. But in this series, the crew of the Enterprise meets a being called Lucian, who looks like a satyr of old mythology. A satyr is, of course, a being that is half man and half goat. He's got goat legs, furry up to his pelvis, and he is a man for the most of the rest of the part, except he has a beard and a mustache and very curly hair, kind of like Greek mythology, and he has 2 horns on his head. And this being is marooned on this planet. He was marooned or imprisoned there by others of either his race or those that had created him at the center of the galaxy. And this character is what most picture Satan to look like. In other words, historic Satan, which most people, there's various views. Most people think that Satan is red with horns and has a pointed tail and a pitchfork, and others, of course, believe in the half-man, half-goat thing, which Satyr probably comes from where the name Satan comes from. Yet in this episode, this being is portrayed as just a misunderstood being who intends no harm to anyone. He just has a different view of things. And he has powers, and therefore he's deemed dangerous. And they really played devil's advocate with this episode. This would be a story that would be replayed years later in the motion picture Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, where the crew of the USS Enterprise is taken over by a band of people hunting heaven, including Spock's half-brother Sybok, who is a radical Vulcan who believes in emotion and has faith. And, of course, if you have faith, you must be radical, right? Well, anyway. The crew, being taken captive, meets eventually at the center of the galaxy, same as in the cartoon, what they believe is God. Kirk, however, is skeptical, and he turns out to be right. Kirk even asked the question of this so-called God, why does God need a starship? Because this person who claims to be God, or this being that claims to be God, who's very powerful and is marooned on this moon, wants them to bring the Starship Enterprise closer where he can join with it and escape the planet that he's on, or the moon. And of course, Kirk argues with him, and Dr. McCoy says, Jim, you don't argue with the Almighty. Because obviously Dr. McCoy believes that this person is God, or this being is God. And again, this being is a dangerous alien with great powers. And of course, in order to free his comrades, Spock's brother Sybok martyrs himself so that everyone else can escape. And of course, he is killed. At the end of this movie, Spock is standing looking out the windows of the recreation area of this Enterprise A, and seems to be lost in thought when Kirk walks up and asks him if he is all right. And Spock, being a Vulcan, as you know, if you're familiar with the Vulcans, they do not show emotion. They do not lament death, nor is he lamenting his brother's death. However, he is puzzled as what this is all meant. He ponders if there is a God. And of course, Captain Kirk, our moral hero character, which everybody loves, says to Spock, maybe God is not out there. Then he points to Spock's chest, to his heart, and says, maybe God is in here. So what message does this send to the viewer? That the strong character of Captain Kirk does not believe in a God or God? His message to Spock is obviously implying that there is no real God as we think of him. And pointing to Spock's heart, in other words, pointing to a man, the message seems to be that God does not exist but in the hearts of men. In other words, if men become virtuous and live a good life and do that which is moral and right, then that's enough. Man, in other words, becomes great like God. The message also seems to imply that God is within man's creation. He was created by man, which is what many spiritualists believe, right along with atheists. Atheists don't believe in God, but they believe that God was created by man. I thought it kind of peculiar that in 1976, in a television interview, which you can find here on YouTube, DeForest Kelley said, when he was asked what he would like to see an episode of Star Trek or a movie be about, he said, I would like to see an episode where the Enterprise meets Jesus Christ in space, but then Christ turns out to be Satan. And I was thinking, that's a point to ponder. Satan coming disguised as Christ to the crew of the Enterprise. But anyway, it kind of astonished me, too, that DeForest Kelley would have wanted to see something like that. But now let's move on to Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Khan, of course, being an Asian name, which is likened to that of Cain. In other words, in some Asian tongues, the word Cain, as spoken in the Bible, is Khan. Khan, of course, is a genetically enhanced, modified human being with superior intellect and strength, who was first encountered by Kirk and crew in the Star Trek, the original series episode, Space Seed, which also is kind of weird that it would be called Space Seed, Satan Seed, where Khan and his cohorts are found in cryogenic freeze stasis aboard a ship called the Botany Bay, a reference to an Australian penal colony. And once Khan is revived from his long sleep of about 200 years or so, 300 maybe, I don't recall, he pretends that he is just a misunderstood being, and all the history that was written about him is simply wrong. But then again, he tries to take over the USS Enterprise and is finally overcome and is exiled to a planet called Ceti Alpha 5 and disappears from Star Trek until the movie The Wrath of Khan. In this movie, The Wrath of Khan, it is revealed that Captain Kirk has a son named David by his former girlfriend named Carol Marcus, who is David's mother. Both Carol Marcus and David Marcus are scientists who have come up with a device which is able to create life from lifelessness, called the Genesis device, named after the book of Genesis in the Bible, creation. This device uses highly unstable forms of protomatter to gain its effect and create life from lifelessness. The message here seems to be that one day mankind will harness the ability to create worlds like unto as God created. Only there is a flaw with the Genesis device, and that it is imperfect. It doesn't really work. This is played out over a 2-movie series. Now, Dr. McCoy states in this movie, according to myth, the earth was created in 7 days. But hold on. Now we can do it for you in 7 minutes. And of course, during the course of this movie, Khan is found again, by accident, and takes over the Starship Reliant. Then sets up a trap to ambush Captain Kirk and his crew. And Khan's surprise attacks the USS Enterprise and cripples it, for a time. And later in the movie, he and Kirk do battle with their starships. And when Khan sees all is lost, he steals the Genesis device, or he had previously stolen it and had it aboard the Reliant with him, and tries to kill Kirk and crew by exploding this device. But he fails, of course, because Spock martyrs himself and goes into the warp drive chamber and fixes the warp drive, which was crippled, allowing the Enterprise to go to warp right before the Genesis explosion happens, to save the Enterprise and her crew. But the result of Khan exploding the Genesis device is a new world is created, which is called Genesis, after the device that created it. And Genesis is a planet where life is evolving. Spock's body, after his funeral, is shot to the planet in his casket, a torpedo casing, and that is virtually the last scene of the movie Star Trek The Wrath of Khan. In the next movie, Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, Captain Kirk has returned to Earth and wants to go back to the Genesis planet, but is denied because it's classified. Captain Kirk then steals the Enterprise with his loyal crew and returns to the Genesis planet to find that Spock has resurrected by the Genesis effect created by the Genesis device in the creation of the planet. Now, as the planet is destroying itself because of the protomatter used in its matrix, Spock somehow manages to survive the matrix of protomatter and goes back to his life. In other words, he lives again. Almost as if Spock has attained a messianic state of resurrection. Only Christ has ever resurrected. And of course, in movies, you can resurrect anybody in any way possible. This is not the only case of this. But it does imply certain things. It does imply that man will harness the power to create worlds, which is what our space program is spending billions of dollars to go and look on Mars for life and waste a whole lot of money while there are people starving to death on this planet. And it does imply that you can escape death. And even now that Leonard Nimoy has died, the character of Spock lives on in the movies. But he did attain this state of kind of messianic resurrection. In the next movie, Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, the crew, while returning from this Genesis planet after having destroyed the USS Enterprise, have stolen a Klingon ship. And once they begin returning home, they find that a probe has parked over the Earth and is destroying the Earth, because the probe is unable to make contact with humpback whales on the planet, which obviously it had some contact with in previous times, which they imply seeded humpback whales to this planet. But it can't make contact with any humpback whales because the humpback whale has been hunted to extinction by the time of Kirk and Spock. Now, there is nothing wrong with the message of this movie of Save the Whales and the idea that whales should not be hunted to extinction. Any animal lover would feel that way. But it is another example of cloaking darker messages in what seems to be a good cause. The notion that the Earth can or will be destroyed by aliens is slightly anti-biblical notion, but then again, so is life in the 23rd century. But that is neither here nor there. Again, it is a fantasy movie. This is science fiction. And like I said, if you can take it with a grain of salt, then it will do you no harm. It probably won't do you any harm anyway. It's just the ideas that these things implant in human minds, specifically kids or young adults. They form opinions by these things. Again, these characters in Star Trek seemingly always fight the good fight. It's just like the character of Star Wars. There's good versus evil. There is the Force versus the dark side of the Force. So all of these characters are moral and caring, which endears them to us and opens the door to where they become heroes. And then the writers of the show can implant these darker messages. And I'm just pointing these things out to those who probably didn't see them or overlooked them or missed them. I'm not saying Star Trek or Star Wars or any of these movies are evil by nature, but they do have darker messages. These movies went on even to the modern times, again with J.J. Abrams' movie, but in 1987, Star Trek The Next Generation took the airwaves, and it opened up the same kind of darker messages that we saw in the Star Trek movies. In the very first episode, Encounter at Farpoint, or maybe it's not Encounter at Farpoint, maybe it was the second episode or the third, I do not remember. I mean, I didn't go and research each episode because I have watched these episodes dozens of times, so I pretty much know them. I just can't remember exactly what episode what was in what. But anyway, whenever they meet the being Q is the episode I refer to. The first meeting ever with Q, who's played by John Delancey. This being Q appears claiming to be omnipotent, which is ridiculous. Only God is omnipotent. And while this being Q puts mankind on trial and threatens to destroy the USS Enterprise D and humanity, Q says this phrase. He says, "Pray to whatever God you believe in," as he implies he will destroy the Enterprise and crew. In other words, he gives them like an hour and he goes, "Pray to whatever God you believe in." He also appears in his true form to them momentarily, or his supposed true form, as a glowing three-headed serpent, which I thought was kind of telling in a way. He does kind of imply a kind of what most people would think of as a mischievous Satan character. And of course, Q really means no harm. He is actually helpful in many cases. It turns out in the end that Q is not really a bad guy. He's just a mischievous being with all this omnipotent power. But, when you think about this, think about what if there was such a character or a being as Q, very powerful and supposedly having an IQ of 2,000 or 2 million, whichever it was. Would these beings, do you think, with that kind of IQ and being beings of that caliber, not know God or not know of God and tell lesser human beings to worship whatever God they see fit? There are strong implications there. There's also another character later in the Star Trek The Next Generation series called Adaud, who possesses very strong powers likened to the Q and kills off an entire race in a moment of rage when his human wife is killed. And again, what kind of message does this put in people's minds when, a single being can destroy an entire race? I mean, yes, our Father has killed off people in the Bible or ordered the children of Israel to kill off people, but there was a reason for that. It was to keep Israel pure from their idolatry, for one thing, and their filth, their filthy lifestyles, abomination, which has become commonplace in today's world, and homosexuality, bisexuality, lesbianism. But it was also to stamp out the seed of the fallen angels. Just as the earth was flooded in the time of Noah, at some point there was either a second influx or some of these angels did survive the flood. First of all, I think it was the Gibor, which is to say the giants, the offspring of the angels, that were killed off in the flood and not the angels themselves. I doubt very seriously that an angel, even a fallen angel, could drown. But regardless of that, we do have angelic worship on this planet and have had. It's in the writings of many peoples all down through history. It's no doubt where the gods of Mount Olympus came from. But in yet another episode, the crew of the Enterprise encounters a primitive, simple people. And again, I'm talking about the next generation here, who are kind of like most would perceive Adam and Eve. They're kind of dumb to the ways of the world. They do know to wear clothing and they are civilized, but they're very simplistic beings. And Captain Picard takes a young woman from the planet aboard the Enterprise and shows her space and shows her this ship that's in orbit around the planet, which is kind of transversing 2 dimensions. And the native woman of this planet falls on her knees, and Captain Picard asks her as if this ship that she's looking at is God. And of course she doesn't say yes, but she is so terrified till she nods her head and acknowledges, yes, this is what we call God. Now, during this time, the ship begins moving towards the Enterprise. And a loud voice shakes the entire Enterprise and says, "Return my child." And of course, Captain Picard does beam her down to the planet, and the ship backs off. But this, along with many other episodes, imply that life in the universe began with a common race, which was seeded on many planets which evolved. And it also implies the idea that all of the gods that are worshipped in the world are actually aliens from other planets, which is what the History Channel and National Geographic and other television shows try to imply in the search for the meaning of life. But there is yet another episode in Star Trek where a bunch of races come together: the Klingons, the Cardassians, the Romulans, humans, Andorians, and others that have been prevalent throughout the series, and they all come together on this one planet and find this generic human being looking creature who claims that they were the progenitors of all the planets, and the person is a female, played by a female, and says, "We seeded you on many planets throughout the universe, and you grew and evolved, and now you have come back here," which kind of implies that creation is a lie, which I know a lot of scientists would get a hard on thinking about, but, those of us with faith do not believe that nonsense. This message is also set forth in Battlestar the Galactica, the original series, which it's odd that I would bring that up, seeing as Richard Hatch died today at the age of 71, who played Captain Apollo, if you remember the original series. But messages like this imply evolution, or seeding by superior beings. In other words, there are books written, Chariots of the Gods, and people believe in UFOs and stuff, when really probably most likely what they are, and I'm going to say definitely what they are. I'm not even going to say most likely, as I just did. These are Nephilim. They're fallen angels. They're not aliens from other planets. I mean, we have been searching the cosmos for, I would say going on 30 or 40 years now, listening and watching. We got the Hubble Space Telescope now. We can't find any sign of life. Now, they claim that there had been life on Mars or water on Mars, and they claimed that there were microbes on Mars, but that is yet to be proven, and probably never will be proven to be accurate. But whichever, whatever. They're spending millions of dollars, like I said, to go to a lifeless planet to see what's on it when we have people starving to death on this planet. I think we should take care of the home planet before we start worrying about trying to colonize others. Now, anyway, this is the explanation of how species and races and all that came about. God didn't create it. It was beings from other planets. In yet another episode, the Klingons supposedly have their own messianic figure called Kahless, the greatest warrior of all time. This plays out through a number of different shows and through a couple of series. It plays out through Star Trek: The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and even references in Voyager. And probably in Star Trek Enterprise. But in this one particular episode, Kahless returns after about 2 millennia. And of course, the Klingons begin worshiping. Now, there are those that are skeptical. In the end, he turns out to be a clone created from DNA taken from the blood of the original Kahless, left on an ancient Klingon dagger. In other words, he is a false Kahless who was engineered, given memories and such. In the same episode, Worf says, "I went in search of my faith. For a time I thought I had found it. Now my heart is empty." Implying that the search for faith is fruitless, and that Kahless, their Klingon Messiah, since he was only a man, kind of precludes the idea that, hey, you know what? Maybe Christ was only a man. The deeper meaning of the message. In other words, as Kahless was just a man, maybe Christ was only a man. A very smart man, but just a man. In other words, even atheists, some of them that is to say, believe in Christ as far as the historical Christ. In other words, the human being man Christ. But they think that he was only a man who spoke good words or said good things or had intelligence. They do not believe he was the Son of God. In still other episodes, where we see Starfleet fighting with the Borg or with the Dominion, every time there is an attack, every time there are massive amounts of lives lost in Star Trek, starships being blown up, which people are being killed on. Of course, you don't see the bodies, but very rarely coming out of the ships. But in not one of these shows do you ever see a show of faith, except the faith of other planets. In other words, you see the faith of the Cardassians, you see the faith of Kahless in the Klingons, you see the faith of the planet that the Cardassians had overruled in Deep Space Nine. Well, dang it, I can't think of the name of the people, but Kira Nerys, if you remember, her character was one of them. We see their faith. They have people that they call Kais, and they have the emissaries, and they've got these beings which are in the wormhole or somewhere in some heavenly realm which communicate with Commander Sisko or Captain Sisko. But in every attack by the Borg or the Dominion or anything for that matter, you never see people on the Enterprise or on Voyager or on any starship praying to God. You never see them ask guidance. Now, the Vulcan religion is explored. The Klingon religion is explored. Like I said, even other religions are explored. But Christianity and the human religion is never explored beyond the myths, the mythical ones. In other words, Islam is never talked about. I don't think even Judaism is talked about. Neither is Christianity. But other mystic religions are talked about. Which, I think that's kind of funny that they would avoid one and speak of the others. But there you go. That's secularism or those that believe in humanism. Now, all of the captains and admirals in these shows will make great speeches about the battles of the past and the human will to survive. They will quote Shakespeare or other human philosophers, but they never ask counsel of God of how to defeat the Borg. I mean, if you were faced with such a threat as the Borg or the Dominion, would you not pray? Yet Captain Picard, Sisko, or Janeway, or even Captain Archer never do. They only point back to history, not even biblical history, or to any kind of divine providence. They only point back to history. They will mention great battles of the past that were won by perseverance, human will to survive, but not by God's divine intervention. In another episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, the Enterprise visits a planet where capital punishment is the law of the government, and Wesley Crusher steps on a green plant, which he gets the death penalty for that, because on their planet, green plants are so highly revered that they're worth more than a human life. But there are other occasions where Captain Picard is confronted with capital punishment, and in one occasion he says to a group of aliens, "We were once as you are, but we are centuries beyond that kind of barbarity." Oh, really? Barbarity? The death penalty? Barbarity? God does not seem to feel that capital punishment or the death penalty is barbarous, for it is written of in the Bible. God himself has practiced capital punishment, and will again, when the souls who rebelled against him, those of Satan and his fallen angels, and those who do not overcome, those who have murdered or whatever, and have not repented, will be cast into the lake of fire, will be cast into hell. But then again, perhaps Captain Picard is just that much smarter than God, right? Well, no, not really. Because Captain Picard, when it comes down to it, is a puppet. He is Patrick Stewart saying the lines written on a piece of paper which tell him what to say in the script. And of course, he's part of Hollywood and the liberal left. So the writers of the shows are expressing their views. Yet when a show expresses Christian values or values of faith, sometimes it will go without ridicule, but for the most part it is ridiculed, especially nowadays. I mean, there were shows recently like Touched by an Angel, and there have been religious shows down through history. But you seldom see those now. And again, Star Trek was made in Hollywood, where leftist idealism, progressivism, secularism is prevalent. That's why they call it the left coast. This same message of the barbarity of the death penalty is reflected again in Voyager when the EMH, that is to say the emergency medical hologram, also makes a comment that the death penalty is a relic of the Dark Ages, when mankind was more childish. He also states that mankind has ascended to new heights of knowledge and wisdom and has moved on from such cruel and outdated ways of thinking as the death penalty. And of course, this is something that's also played out in Star Trek a number of times, is that brain chemistry can be altered and people can change. Now, I'm not saying that people can't change. But it's utter nonsense to call God's word, or what's written in God's word, barbarity. Then, of course, we have the next conundrum. Holograms, like the Voyager EMH or the Android Data. Then the question becomes, are they alive? Are they sentient? Do they have souls? Should they have the same human rights as human beings? Should a hologram have the same rights? Now, this implies that man is able to create life and to give souls. In other words, Data was created in the show by a character called Dr. Noonien Soon, and who also plays into the con line in some facet. But regardless of that, the implication is that Data, even though he's an android, and, Data is a very lovable character. You cannot love Star Trek without loving Commander Data. But does Data have a soul? Well, does man have the ability to make a soul? I don't think so. Does a hologram have a soul? No, I don't think so. I mean, even if we did have that kind of technology, we do have robots now, and even robots that can emulate humans and stuff like that. But are they real? Do they have souls? No. Only God can create a living being. Only God can create nefesh, which is to say the living soul. The only other thing that I saw about this, which, is not terribly harmful, but it's that the hologram in the android is virtually immortal. Their lifespan is usually a lot longer than a human being, and there are other beings in the series which live longer. The Klingons live longer than Earthlings in Star Trek, and Vulcans do too, but Data conceivably could have been an immortal. He is eventually killed in one of the last movies of the series where he martyrs himself, but Data, in one point in Star Trek, says that he could virtually live forever. And of course, the emergency medical hologram is tantamount to the same thing. A hologram can always be rebooted. Even though they would come out with newer ones, it's a foregone conclusion. Even shows like Red Dwarf from Britain. The hologram there is very old. The ship itself is 3 million years old. So, anyway. When you think about Data and his ability to think and process information, or this android, they're often very much smarter than human beings. And they don't succumb to the weaknesses and frailties of human beings. Until Data, of course, takes the computer chip, which makes him more like a human, where he can laugh and cry and feel fear and such. And of course, the Doctor breaches his program and grows beyond it. But again, these things are unreal. They're fantasy. Now, as we move on in Star Trek, we also seen the Go Green movement, the global warming climate change message. In one episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, a scientist and his sister, who is also a scientist, are trying to convince Starfleet and other races that warp drive is destroying the fabric of space. And this woman, no one will listen to. So in an extreme action, she takes her own life by blowing up exploding a runabout space shuttlecraft. To show the crew of the Enterprise that, yes, indeed, warp drive is destroying the fabric of space. And it makes her seem like she had to go to that extreme. She had to go to that extreme to kill herself to be listened to. Making science out to look martyrsome or martyrdomish. And more righteous. In other words, this woman was willing to give up her life to prove that they were destroying space. Just like people now are willing to get out and do what they do to prove global warming, which is total bullshit anyway. I mean, we know that the Earth goes through heating and cooling cycles, and the Earth has been doing that since well before man was ever mechanized, well before greenhouse gases, well before carbon emissions, well before coal was burning. But nobody wants to listen to that reason. I mean, just by watching the ice ages that have come and gone, you could figure that out, but that makes common sense. And science will talk about the ice ages, but they won't talk about that because it doesn't fit into their view. Anyway, it's implied by the writers. See, the whole message of Star Trek connects with us as human beings now. There are messages in these shows. The writers are telling us in messages like from that show where the scientist kills herself to prove that warp drive is destroying space, that we are destroying ourselves too. And that we're too blind to see it. And that science holds all the answers if only people would listen to reason and quit being superstitious and believing that God is in control. Of course, we also see this on modern day television about natural disasters. It is implied that an asteroid or a comet or some other big natural catastrophe, a supervolcano, a black hole, solar flares, a mega tsunami, will destroy the Earth or cause clouds to cover the Earth so that we fall into another ice age. And the implication is always, it's not a matter of if it will happen, but when. And we see this in dozens of movies. Movies like Avatar. Avatar is basically Dances with Wolves made into a science fiction movie. I mean, think about it. You've got this Captain Dunbar, or whatever the hell his name was, Corporal Dunbar, Lieutenant Dunbar, in Dances with Wolves, who goes to seek out the American Indians and befriend them, and of course he becomes acclimated to them, and then here comes the hateful military, the hateful United States military, which, of course, the military did do horrible things to the American Indian. Not saying they didn't, not defending them, but by the same token, in Avatar, you've got this crippled character who goes into the Avatar and he's able to walk again, and he becomes acclimated to the other blue people of this Avatar planet. And because of that, he becomes more likened to their idealisms and becomes a traitor to his own race. And of course, the military is portrayed as doing nothing but wanting to destroy nature. And of course, man is a destroyer of nature. I'm not saying that either. They do cut down rainforests and they do destroy this earth, but you know what? They replant them. Forests come back. I mean, Mount St. Helens, perfect example. They said there will not be life there for 50 years. Well, they're already evergreens 50 feet tall, except in some places. But that is neither here nor there either. But these same things are put out there in movies to scare us. Movies like Deep Impact from years ago, or Asteroid, or a number of others. Or, of course, Alien Invasions, which were pushed in movies like Independence Day. Or the new War of the Worlds movie. And, like I said, these things put irrational fears into people's minds that these things could happen. Like I said, remember what War of the Worlds, the radio show, did? Well, these things, when you watch them, go into your head and they sink in. And that's why people come up with this whole Star Trek mentality that, aliens must have seeded us to this planet, or they began the primordial ooze which caused evolution. Another big thing in Star Trek Voyager and Star Trek The Next Generation is the Big Bang. There's always the Big Bang. The Big Bang, nobody can prove any more than anything. All they can prove, or I don't even know that they can prove it, that they claim they can prove it, is that the universe is expanding. But, if that is the case, God designed the universe to expand. For whatever reason. Why are there galaxies that are so beautiful? Why are there nebulas and pulsars way out there that we can't see with the naked eye? God obviously sees them. God is the one that created them. Maybe they're his artwork. People will ask me, where did God come from? What was he doing before he created us? Well, maybe that was it. Who knows? Maybe that was his canvas. At any rate, as alluded to earlier, evolution is all throughout Star Trek is the most sensible, most logical explanation to how man came into being. In all the series of Star Trek, I don't care what it is. In one show of Star Trek The Next Generation, Captain Picard and Data are returning on a shuttle mission, or from a shuttle mission, to the Enterprise, but they cannot raise the Enterprise on subspace frequency message. And soon they go to the coordinates where the Enterprise was last in the general vicinity, and they find the Enterprise tumbling through space. And of course they board her. And when they get aboard, they find that the crew has de-evolved. Riker has become a Hostalipithecine, Neanderthal. Troi is turned into an amphibian, a frog lady. Barclay has de-evolved into some kind of a half-man, half-spider. Worf is a horned, spined creature. Dr. Ogawa, who is Beverly Crusher's sickbay assistant, has become a chimpanzee. And Data's cat Spot has turned into a lizard, amongst other crewmen and women who have become various other things. This is also played out in a number of other episodes of shows of Star Trek. Voyager, where the hologram speaks of human evolution whenever there's something medical goes wrong. He talks about them evolving from apes. And of course they are referred to as apes in a number of places. Likewise in Dragon Ball Z. And even in Dragon Ball Z, you've got now where they're Super Saiyan gods. I mean, they're not just Super Saiyans, they're Super Saiyan gods. And they can come back from the dead. You know, all of these science fiction shows seem to have one everlasting theme. You know, even Doctor Who. You know, Doctor Who keeps reinventing himself in the regenerations. And now they're going transgender with him. They're wanting to make a female doctor. Which will kill the series. You know, sorry if that offends you, but it will. It will kill the series. Because the Doctor's always been male. And transgenderism was not introduced until a couple of seasons back. Matter of fact, I think it was last season. Last season, I believe it was, that the first time a Time Lord had ever transformed from male to female. And then, of course, you've got all the homosexual rigmarole, which is involved with Star Trek and Doctor Who. But we'll get to that in a minute. Staying on the subject of evolution, in the final episode of Star Trek The Next Generation called All Good Things, Q places Picard through it in 3 separate times. In other words, past, present, and future. And it's a test for Picard to figure out how to solve the problem. And Q takes him back to the Earth before there was life on it. Supposed Earth, anyway. And shows him this green gel in the water, which Q labels as the primordial ooze. The thing that began life on Earth. And Q says to Picard, "You caused this, mon capitaine. You see this?" In other words, pointing at the ooze. "This is you, and oh look, nothing happened." Meaning, life never began, Picard, because you fired some kind of energy burst into the universe in the future, and it traveled backwards through time. And it began and went through all of history and would cause all history and everything that had been to be erased. In other words, as far as humankind anyway. And again, these messages show everyone preaching evolution. In other words, the writers of these shows are actually the voice pieces, not the characters in them. The characters are made to be lovable, respectable, moral, righteous, non-biased, non-judgmental, always trying to do the right thing. But their mouths simply repeat the lines written on a piece of paper in the script of the show. And of course, the script talks about creation is myth, faith is fruitless, unless of course it's Klingon faith, or Cardassian faith, or whatever other kind of faith. Anything but human faith. This is also prevalent in Doctor Who, and again in other shows. The bad part is this nonsense is also taught in our schools and colleges. So you've got bombardment by the media You got bombardment by television and movies, and you got bombardment by colleges and schools, even right down to the grade school levels, on young, impressionable minds. And school is mandatory, whereas faith or church or study of the Bible is optional. So kids are being indoctrinated with doctrines, false doctrines, science fiction doctrines, which seem all too real. We are allowing kids to be forced to drink the water and eat the bread of lies, of man's ignorance and stupidity, while educators call faith in God ignorance and myth, and imply that anyone who believes in faith or God is living in the darkness of ignorance, when in reality it is they who cannot see. It is they who are ignorant. Romans 1:22, professing themselves to be wise, they became as fools. Well, guess what? That's who we're talking about. And Star Trek and Doctor Who, as well as other shows, have been very proactive in dabbling into sex change, homosexuality, bisexuality, and, of course, transgenderism of late. In one episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, Commander Riker falls in love with an ambiguous female. Now, the role is played by a female, but these people are people that are androgynous. They don't identify as either sex. And I don't really know that I don't remember how they procreated. I don't think it was in the sexual act. I think they procreated or brought themselves alive asexually. But their normal traits begin to come out of them and bleed through at times. In other words, at the beginning of the show, this person is realizing her identity as a woman. And of course, Commander Riker falls in love with her because she, even though she's androgynous, is a beautiful woman and is very frail and tender and is kind of like the damsel in distress that needs to be protected, which is how they endear you to her. So she begins bleeding out her female genetics, her female processes. But on this world, they have outlawed gendered. And these aliens are controlled with drugs and or computers or machinery. The woman tells Riker that she wants to leave with him and that she's in love with him. And of course, they are seen to be kissing several times in the show, or being close to each other. But then her government seizes her and puts her through this treatment, and the very next time Riker sees her, she's back to being sexless and has lost her feelings for him, and of course, he is hurt. This also plays out in another aspect of Star Trek genre. It plays out in Deep Space Nine, where you've got symbiotes such as Jadzia Dax or Jezria Dax, who are females. They're symbiotes who are host bodies for other beings inside of them. Now, Curzon Dax was a man. And Curzon was killed in the early episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and his symbiote was moved into the body of Jadzia Dax. And of course, now Jadzia Dax is a female where she had been a male. And Captain Sisko even refers to her as Old Man because he knew Curzon Dax. And, so the man has changed into the woman's body. We got Bruce Jenner all over here, And likewise, in Star Trek The Next Generation, there is an episode where Dr. Beverly Crusher falls in love with one of these sane symbiotes of the same race, who is injured, and as he lays dying, his new host symbiote body arrives, which is female. But after the operation, when the symbiote is placed into the female's body, the female comes to Dr. Crusher and wants to continue the relationship. Now, to the writer's credit, in this particular episode, Dr. Crusher is repulsed and abhors the idea and refuses. But in other episodes of Star Trek, whether Star Trek, it's Star Trek Enterprise, there arises a situation where this female has feelings for the female Vulcan science officer of the ship. And they become close and very nearly kiss. And of course, you will see women massaging women and men massaging men, kind of ambiguously being gay with each other. And of course, they do get closer than they should. And of course, in the new J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies, in tribute to George Takei, they're making Mr. Sulu into a homosexual. Even though George Takei did not approve, even a gay man himself, George Takei, did not approve of Mr. Sulu being made into a gay character. When he was asked, he said, "I have taken many years to create this character, and I don't really think that they need to make Sulu gay." And of course, that's just the way it is. I mean, when a gay man doesn't even want a character to be gay, a character that he created to be a heterosexual and who in later movies has a daughter, in Star Trek, let's see, what was that? Star Trek Generations. In Star Trek Generations, Mr. Sulu has a daughter. Captain Kirk tells her the Enterprise wouldn't be the same without a Sulu on board. Well, how's that going to happen now in this new timeline with Sulu being a homo, But even George Takei, to his credit, being a gay man himself, does not want Mr. Sulu to be a homosexual. Now, this is also played out in Doctor Who, in the new series. In 2005, when they brought Doctor Who back, after a 10-year absence or so, 9 years, 1996 was the Doctor Who movie with Paul McGann. When they brought him back, the first Doctor of this series, Christopher Eccleston, the first gay character was introduced. And he was not introduced as gay. When he was introduced, you kind of thought he was a ladies' man because his name is Captain Jack. And he's a handsome man, and he's very caring and a martyr himself, even willing to martyr himself for the Doctor or whoever. But it's eventually shown that he is gay. He even gives the Doctor his first kiss, and it's a pretty sickening kiss, which, made my stomach turn. But then in the 10th Doctor's time, the Doctor is David Tennant's Doctor. Before he regenerates, goes around playing matchmaker and sets this Captain Jack up with a boyfriend just before he regenerates. And again, even in the first series of this in 2005, the first male kiss in a Doctor Who show, which made me sick because I grew up with Doctor Who, Back in the 70s, before Doctor Who was a thing, I watched it on public television. You could watch shows like Monty Python and The Goodies and many other shows from Britain at that time, Doctor Who included. And I began watching The Doctor with John Pertwee, who was the third Doctor, and Tom Baker, and went through Peter Davison and Sylvester McCoy and the other McCoy. I can't think of his first name. But regardless, the Doctor had always been male, and he'd always been masculine for the most part. He never had any gay tendencies, and that never really came up. It was something that was kept out of the public eye, like it should be, We have to tolerate it now because it's all the rage, but, it still makes one sick to watch. The Doctor has always represented masculine or cool or intelligent, and seeing the Doctor trade a lip lock with a gay man, simply to appease the appetites of homosexuals was not, in my book, a really smart move for Doctor Who, but that's the way of the world that we live in. Generation of the fig tree. Turning everything upside down. Making right out to be wrong, wrong out to be right. Now, even in new Star Trek films, such as The Continuing Voyages, which is a fan-based thing on YouTube here, and I don't really want to give a lot of credence to it, but Captain Kirk's nephew is gay. He's introduced at some point. And of course, this Captain Kirk approves of him being gay, whereas the 1960s Captain Kirk would most likely have been sick to his stomach and probably not had much to do with him other than he's family. But now, like I said, it's all the rage, particularly in Star Trek fan films. I've noticed a host of them on the internet here where homosexuality is just focused on. There's even a gay wedding at one of the beginning of them. And of course, they're made by college students who are movie makers and will be the movie makers of the next generation, so you know what you're going to get. But let's move on. The next darker message came from Star Trek Voyager, where a rogue member of the Q Continuum decides he is bored. In other words, these Q, as you probably know if you know what the Q are, the Q Continuum, they're immortal beings. They never die. And of course, in the show, they're omnipotent. Now, this Q, which they're all called Q in case you don't know it, they refer to each other as Q. When one Q sees another, he says Q, but anyway, this Q decides that he's bored. He's done everything in the universe. He's seen everything there is to see, done everything there is to do, been everything there is to be. So the Q decide he are a danger to them. So they lock him away in a comet, and Voyager inadvertently frees him. And he comes aboard the Voyager, and pretty soon the character of Q from Star Trek The Next Generation, the famous Q, John Delancey, appears. And of course, these Q, which are much higher beings, decide to let Captain Janeway, a human judge, be the judge over them as to whether this Q should be allowed to die or not. And of course, Q tries to bribe her with taking her back to planet Earth. As you know, if you know Star Trek Voyager, they're 70,000, 80,000 light years away from Earth by an accident. But the implication being here with this Q is that everlasting life will just get boring and dull at some point and won't be worth living anymore. You will have done everything, you will have been everything, and he'll eventually become omnipotent, which you won't. But, the Bible speaks of the tree of life and people going to the tree of life and being renewed. Not only are they renewed with eternal life, but renewed with newness. In other words, you can't get bored. You don't suffer this kind of stuff. This is a very humanistic or a very human, fleshly way of looking at immortality in this particular episode of Voyager. It's a very poor portrayal of eternal life, and of course, it's all science fiction anyway. At any rate, this rogue Q wins his case and is made mortal and is allowed to die. He commits suicide. And, of course, the crew of Voyager feels very bad about this, and of course, so does Janeway. And there are seeds in this that Q's going to go back radical again as he had been. But, this is just another aspect of humans and leftists and humanists and science fiction scientists writing scripts. People that have been to Berkeley, Berkeley, where they wouldn't even let this gay guy speak just because he happens to be a conservative, and they threw a fit and burned things. I mean, that's real fair. We don't listen to other point of views. Christians and conservatives and law-abiding have to listen to every other point of view. But if you're a gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, radical, a terrorist, an anarchist, you don't have to listen to anyone's point of view. If you're a progressive, a secular, you don't have to listen to anyone else's point of view because they're all wrong and they're all morons. So you don't even have to give them ear. You're just too smart for them. No other view is allowed. There used to be a word called censorship, which liberals throw around quite a lot when their point isn't heard. But when the conservative view is not heard, well, that's okay. Because there is a double standard. Let's move on to another nefarious message in Star Trek. The traitor aspect. There is an episode where a Roman admiral disguises himself as a low-grade lieutenant. He is actually Admiral Giroc, and betrays his own people. He runs to the Federation with a bunch of stolen plans showing that the Romulans plan to attack the Federation. And of course, the Enterprise goes to where he says they will be, and the plants and things that they're building to mask for an attack on the Federation to verify what he says. And of course, the Enterprise is caught by the Romulans. And it is revealed in this episode that all of these plans were fake, and they were simply to test this admiral to see where his loyalties lied. And of course, he turned out to be a traitor to his people. However, Captain Picard doesn't see it that way. No, of course not. Captain Picard, when the show ends and Admiral Giroc finally commits suicide, Captain Picard says, "If only there were more people in the Romulan Empire with the courage of Admiral Giroc." The courage of Admiral Giroc? What, to sell out your own people? Oh yeah, that's very courageous to be a traitor. At least in this case. The hell this traitor is a hero. Now, there may be times when a corrupt government needs the whistle blown on them, but none of that was implied in this episode. There was nothing like that implied in this episode. This was taking state secrets and strengths and giving it to your enemy. In other words, it'd be the same thing as espionage or what occurred during the Cold War when spies would come over here and pose as Americans and take stuff back to Russia. And a lot of times they were executed for that, if they were caught. Which they should have been. A traitor should be executed. Now you've got different cases like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden where there are probably some things that they revealed which are intricate little points. I mean, there is nothing absolute when it comes to this. But we all know that the media has been lying to us for years. And the things being pointed out by WikiLeaks and this guy, Edward Snowden, seem to have merit to them now, whereas before they did not. But as you live, you learn. I wouldn't call that necessarily being a traitor. It's because they're not necessarily putting our military secrets out to the world and telling them where our A-bombs are or anything like that. They're simply exposing our government for the lies they have told and the things they've covered up. But how much of it is real and how much of it is imagined, none of us can know because we don't have access to it. But let's look at another episode of this kind of turnaround mentality where something bad is made into something good. Here, in this episode I just spoke of, a traitor is made out to be a hero. Well, in another episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, we enter terrorism. The episode is called The High Ground. There are a group of aliens who are planting bombs in malls and in shopping areas and killing innocent people. And they're escaping through a trans-dimensional shift. At one point, they take Beverly Crusher, Dr. Crusher, captive. And while she's in their captivity, she tells them that the teleporters, the trans-dimensional teleporters that they're using, are killing them. But what the really bad part of this is that this terrorist who is leading this group is made out to be a misunderstood figure. Now, the man who plays this guy was cast. He was a handsome actor, and he is made out to be more human than terrorist. Very caring. He's made out to be artistic. He sits around and draws and sketches pictures of Beverly Crusher, specifically her eyes. In other words, to show us what a deep-feeling man he is. I mean, hey, there's nothing like a deep-feeling terrorist that kills innocent people, right? But see, this endears us to him. This endears the TV viewer to him, to understand what he is, to understand his pain, why he has to commit terrorism and kill innocent people. Now, when Dr. Crusher tells him that he's doing wrong by killing innocent people, he quickly jumps to the defensive and compares himself to George Washington because he studied Earth history. He said that what he is doing is no different than George Washington. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't really recall George Washington murdering a non-combatant at a mall or at a shopping place. Not that there were malls then, but there were certainly markets. So they paint this terrorist to seem like he's a misunderstood, beautiful, deep person and by the end of the show, even sort of a hero. When terrorists are really cowards who hide in the shadows and conspire and kill innocent people. I don't care whether they're Muslim or whether they're homegrown or whatever they are. They're cowards. Now, let's look at Starfleet for a minute. What does that represent? Starfleet and the United Federation of Planets. Have you ever noticed their symbol? It looks an awful lot like the UN's. It's a group of planets brought together, much like our New World Order is forming, under one flag, having a common prime directive. And they are a hodgepodge of different races in one alliance, all cooperating with each other, a brotherhood of man. And they don't need to worry about food. They've got replicators. Money means nothing to them. They don't really have to worry about anything. As a matter of fact, Captain Picard even states in one episode that we did away with hunger years ago. We did away with hunger and want, and now we no longer fight wars. But then, of course, the Borg come along, and the Klingons, and everything else, and Romulans, and they do fight battles or skirmishes, and then full-blown wars. So, that whole idea of the peaceful Federation is out the window right with that. But the Federation is always on the good side. In other words, they're always the ones seeking peace. They're always the ones trusting in getting duped. But what do we see in this? Well, we see a galactic government rather than a global one like we're facing, whose sole goal is peace. Yeah, sure thing. There is even an episode where the USS Enterprise D in Star Trek The Next Generation is sent to make first contact with a planet which is about to discover warp drive. They're already doing tests, much as the Vulcans discovered Earth by Zephram Cochrane and the Phoenix, if you remember your Star Trek history. I don't know how many of you are fans of the show, but if you know it, you know that Zephram Cochrane was even referred to in all the Star Trek series, even the original series. But Captain Picard beams down to this planet where they're about to discover warp drive with Counselor Troy and meets one of the engineers of this warp drive technology. Riker has already gone down to spy on the planet and has become lost or is missing, so they're also in search of him. But finally, Captain Picard meets this scientist, and she's astonished to see a human being because they are very much like us. They're humanoid with slightly different variances. Their hands are different, and they have maybe different facial features. So she recognizes him as an alien. But she trusts him because he says, "We come in peace." And he explains to her that when a race is about to make, or a planet or a solar system is about to enter into the realm of warp space travel, they come and make first contact with them then, to try to gain an alliance. And eventually this woman takes Captain Picard to meet the president of the world. Now, on this world, they do have one world leader. So that's another correlation to the Bible, only he's not Satan. But after this president of the world talks with Picard and goes aboard the Enterprise and sees his planet from space, and they beam back down, the president says, "This morning I woke up as the leader of all I knew, and tonight I find I'm only a voice in a larger chorus. But I think it was a good day." Well, of course, being sucked into a large government like the NWO or the United Federation of Planets is just a wonderful thing. And in a way it is, really, because when one world government comes, we will know that that is the signal for the false Christ. And then there will be a deadly wound, and then will appear the Antichrist, and after that, the true Christ. Now, in this episode, of course, there is the obligatory dissenter, who naturally is portrayed as being closed-minded, being afraid of change because he does not want to have any dealings with the Federation, and of course he tries to frame Commander Riker by shooting himself with Riker's phaser, which fortunately for him is only set for stun. But it implies if you are not pro-Federation, in other words pro-global government, that you're narrow-minded. Now, I'm not pro-global government, but I know it has to pass. Why? It's written in our Father's Word. At any rate, these are just some examples of the many that I could have gone into. If I'd looked, I could have found way more. These are just some of the examples I have seen in these television shows. Now, while there is nothing wrong with escaping into dreams, and even into these shows and enjoying the fiction, and enjoying the space travels and the adventures and meeting aliens and stuff, I have for many years since my childhood, I do think one should be aware of these deeper cloaked messages within these shows. The lack of faith in the shows, or speaking of God, that's key in these shows. I mean, let's think about Doctor Who for a minute. Doctor Who has got the TARDIS, a time-traveling machine. He can go anywhere and see anything that ever has happened or ever will. But not one time has he ever gone and met Christ, or Moses, or any figure of the Bible. I mean, if you were Doctor Who and you had this time machine that could go back, he's been to Pompeii, he's been to visit the Aztecs, he's been all sorts of places, he's been to the future and to the past. But if you were the Doctor, would you not go and want to meet Moses? I mean, the Doctor is, after all, according to the Doctor Who canon, half human. So human blood flows through his veins along with Time Lord blood. So if you were Doctor Who, would you not go back and meet Christ, or meet Moses, or meet King David, or King Solomon, or virtually any character of the Bible? Sure you would. But the BBC and Hollywood, with their secular agendas, or their humanist agendas, or their mythological agendas, are willing to pander to science, and to mythology, and to popular human figures, but never Christ or any biblical character. And they're willing to pander to other religions, even some earthly religions, as long as they don't have to do with Christ or Judaism. It's almost a forbidden topic in these shows. Though again, fictional religions of the other people are talked about. And in them, they try to mirror back at us what our religions are all about. In other words, they try to make them all out to be fake. They're shown to be tripe, they're shown to be unfulfilling and unreal, and a bunch of nonsense. Deep Space Nine would probably be the exception, where the Pa race, I guess is what they were called, or the, I can't remember what they were called, the, anyway, Captain Sisko is an emissary, and of course these beings do have supernatural powers. But they're kind of like the Q. They're a bunch of different gods, supposedly. They're not one God. They're not monotheistic. They're not our Father. And none of them know our Father. Never heard of him. Never mentioned him. And none of these shows ever mention him. So this is what I wanted to point out in this talk. Like I said, this is just a discussion, just a rant, just a whatever you want to call it. Like I said, I don't see anything wrong with watching sci-fi and enjoying it. But especially if your children are watching it, you should ground them in the truth. You should always ground them in the truth and let them know what the truth is. Because this stuff is a danger. Like I said, Dragon Ball Z is a very entertaining cartoon, and so are many others. But usually they have a deeper, darker message. You know, the whole idea of the Super Saiyan is that, I mean, first of all, they illuminate, they power up, and they have greater powers than average human beings. But they always fight for the good. The character of Goku is someone that's always good. But he doesn't know God. To him, God is some big fat guy sitting on a chair and at what they call Heaven's Gate, I guess. Not really Heaven's Gate, it's the afterlife. What they call it is Otherworld. But they do have a hell. They do have a hell. They do have a character named Satan, but they have nothing for God. The Kais are their gods, or Guru, or the watchers that watch from the tower. I can't remember what they're called either, just at the moment. But Dende is one of them. The Namecs, Namek watchers. They are referred to as gods. So, like I said, choose your poison. They're pumping all this stuff into the minds of kids. And of course, that stuff's been going on. Even if you looked at things like Superman, it's not so innocent. I mean, Superman has always been an American hero, Captain America, Wonder Woman, but, look at them. In the latter days here, Superman has become, they even made a series and a video game called Justice League: Gods Among Us, where Superman is revered in another universe as a god. And that played out in a couple of the television series where he was almost like an Antichrist figure. But then there's Wonder Woman, who comes from an island of Amazons who worship Greek gods, and she wears a red star on her forehead. Red star. Okay? Communism. Now, Wonder Woman is anything but communism. But the least of them is Batman. Batman is a human being. Yet he hangs with all of them, and by and large, he's more intelligent than they are. He's able to defeat Superman, even in the movies. But even he has taken a darker twist from the Batman that I knew as a younger man. He is more like the comic book character Batman now, except much more violent. But people don't really realize, and I guess they don't care. They take their kids to see these movies, and they never think twice about the messages in them or what it's going to do to the kids' minds. Superman being treated as a god. I don't think that's a good idea, and kids will sit down and play these video games for hours on end. So, it's not just Japanese anime. It's all through our history. There have been stories of false gods, or even the gods of Mount Olympus, like I said, probably, most likely, and I would even say surely, brought down to us in legend and lore and myth from the Nephilim or from giants. Even the Apollo character in the episode I mentioned of Star Trek, who mourns for Adonis, is able to become a giant. He's able to reach out and grab the Enterprise with a green hand in space. He's able to shock the Enterprise with lightning waves. So, like I said, just take it with a grain of salt. There's nothing harmful in comic books, really. There's nothing harmful in science fiction if you know what you're looking at. But it does put impressions on young minds. So, ground your children first in the Bible. It's just like God or Christ said, seek ye the kingdom of God first. Do that, then you'll know how to handle this stuff. Your kids won't be indoctrinated to evolution. They won't be indoctrinated to a bunch of global nonsense, global warming, and climate change. And like I said, these people always cloak themselves in good behind labels such as Greenpeace and the Sierra Club and other things. It's what the Kenites do. They cloak themselves in good, and they still get their message across. At any rate, that's where I'm going to end this. I just wanted to bring these points forth. Like I said, I think they should be known about. I don't think they're that big of a danger if you watch and if you're careful. But I think if you go and watch a lot of these shows again and watch these series again, you'll see these messages and you'll begin to see more. Especially if you're in tune with our Father's Word and doing the study as you should, and you should be doing. You should be using the tools God afforded us to study His Word. It is my hope and prayer that you will do so. And always remember to pray for those that walk in darkness. They are the ones that need it the most. May God bless you, and thank you for listening. This has been Just Thoughts.